great because it does um, give us a perspective that's a little bit more global in our work. Um, so I can start with with kind of like the presentation and some of the questions. Yep. Okay. Um, so let me share my screen. Um, ah, okay, here we go. Share, and then I'll go into presentation mode. Um, view slideshows. All right, here we go. Can anyone see and hear me okay?
Perfect.
Cool. All right. So, I mean, thank you so much for the invitation and for the introduction. These are a lot of fun. So I'm looking forward to discussing with colleagues in the region, and almost kind of validating some of the observations we've had over the past year. Um, and then some familiar faces in the audience. It's good to see everyone. I saw Rena there too, and Don and other folk. So looking forward to your inputs for sure. So a little bit about Open North. Open North has been around for a while. So they started in 2011, almost at the genesis of the open data movement as well. And always been champions for open data in Canada and elsewhere. We were one of the first signatories of the Open Data Charter, and are always happy to promote the principles that as a community we all came up with. Um, we're based in Canada, um, though I am actually currently in Bogota, Colombia, but normally we're based in Canada. Um, and our um, organizational mission and our vision has a little bit evolved. So we primarily were focused a lot on open data, but um, as we kept engaging in this area, we found other issues surrounding data and the power relationships and the decisions around data were coming up and up in our work. So we started talking about data governance and shared data, and then the technologies that facilitate the use and sharing of data, which led us to thinking about smart cities, consultations, um, and civic technology. Um, cool. So here's some of the things we've been up to in the last little bit. Um, so we've been engaging in Canada with the multi-stakeholder forum on open government, and there's a big portion there, and I see a few colleagues from the OGP. So we're involved in the civil society mechanism that works with government to put forward national action plan commitments and almost publicly committing government to fulfilling the open government agenda. And open data is a big part of that. Another project we've been working on is with the Ending Violence Association of Canada. So they're a group that seeks to support survivors and advocates of survivors of sexual assault here in Canada. And they're finding ways that data can help with that need and ease some of the burden that frontline service organizations face. And this one's been really interesting in including it because it's challenged some of our assumptions that we have on how data is shared. Just very shortly, sometimes we found that working with very vulnerable populations and populations that could be harmed if data falls in the wrong hands, that maybe siloed data in those cases is the solution which I know it's super counterintuitive because we've been working on open data so long saying like we need to break down silos, but in this case, well-being of survivors kind of supersedes that value, um, which I'm happy to answer questions about that too. Um, and our work is very local, so we continue to work with cities across Canada on how they're addressing different data and um, digital transformation issues in form of consultancy. And finally, I wanted to bring up some of our work on climate change and kind of the intersection, and we'll have a chance to discuss this, of climate change and open data, and kind of how we as a movement in open data can position ourselves in this space where there is, well, honestly, it's flushed with cash and interest. So thinking about the broader strategies of how we keep open data movement going, this subject matter for us has been really interesting and is something worth pursuing, I think. Um, right. So with these observations, I'll link it back to some of the projects I talked about, but happy to hear some questions and some comments on it as well. So from our end, at least in Canada, we've seen that the agenda on open data is almost in retreat. So in the federal government, we see changes in budget priorities. We see political shifts. That means the open data agenda is not always front of mind. So for those not familiar with Canadian politics, the current Liberal government, led by Justin Trudeau, was very explicit and was a clear champion of open data and even pushed internationally for Canada to be positioned that way. That's no longer the case. Open data is not necessarily, at least from our perspective or from what we're seeing, open data is not necessarily front of mind, often in government circles. And then that is reflected in funding and budgets that goes towards open data initiatives. We found that adapting to other areas where open data contributes to, but it's not necessarily the center of the topic, has been helpful. So we've been gearing a lot of our information, a lot of our products towards AI, towards privacy, and how decisions around data, whether to open data, fits into that. We found that, and like given this audience, I would be curious to hear if others have found the same. We found that that's where some of the funding is working. And as I mentioned, we obviously I wouldn't predict what the outcome of the next election would be, but there might be a change of government in the next Canadian election. So we're thinking about how and kind of learning lessons from other places like Argentina, how we adapt to a government that might not be as friendly necessarily to initiatives like the ones we like and the ones that might not be as open to more transparent, accountable government. Or there might be, right? Like I don't want to reveal my political leanings, but we don't know. That's the uncertainty. So we're thinking about how we're more flexible. Sorry, I'm not keeping track of time, so I hope I'm not
I am
going
no
over
problem.
now.
You have 4 more minutes.
All right, yeah, so it'll be a couple more slides. So the next big observation I wanted to do in this presentation was that governments are not the only actors in open data, and it's something we've been exploring a lot more. And it's funny because I think Don can speak to this in the audience. We've been trying to engage different organizations, not just government, that have real data needs, that think about open data. And like, from my experience, like a lot of our framing on open data was towards government early in the last decade. Makes us sound older than I think a lot of us are. But in the last decade, a lot of the engagements were how do we open government data? They have a lot of data repositories. But we found that civil society, frontline service organizations, they collect and have a lot of data, and they have a lot of opinions about data that exist in government. In a few of our projects, because government data might not always be as useful as civil society needs it to be, a civil society organization choose not to engage with that data or collect their own data sets. So something that we've explored in the movement too is how like we can create these data collaborations, data partnerships outside of government necessarily. Obviously with still a relation and a link to it, but even maybe not as dependent as previously. It's super cool. Like I'm excited to keep exploring that. All this is still a little bit green, for lack of a better word, but it's very interesting to see how that's where we're going. As well as going, and again, just referencing here mechanisms like the OGP, ODC, going outside of national engagements for Canada. So we very much, and that's kind of why I exist in Open North, is we're very much thinking of bringing a lot of local lessons globally and how we can work both nationally but supranationally. And I think the ODC is an excellent example of this forum where we draw different lessons. Like we draw lessons from like Chris, from like their quality indexes and other places, so that we can understand how our work fits globally. Because issues like climate change, air quality, they don't stop at imagined borders that governments, decided upon, right? These are complex challenges that need that full of both national and supranational approaches. And this is a big question for us. Oh, go ahead, Matthew.
Sorry to interrupt you, but this should be your last slide.
It is my last slide.
Awesome.
So this is a big question for us, and folks that have seen me engaging in the different forum and that talk to me know that I get really annoying, not annoying, but just repeat this often. Is how does open data fit with data governance and with this other universe where considering that issues of privacy and security are being brought up, how do we balance that with goals of transparency and openness? I don't think there's one answer, right? Like each context is different, and depending on how vulnerable populations are, existing norms and cultures around data and capacities around data determines this question for us. So I don't think there's an either or. I think the other element that for me is important is that there is this open data movement that exists that we can leverage. I don't think it's worth throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? With the expression. So how do we leverage the movement and adapt it so that it continues to build on the capacities and the connections that already exist? Yeah, that is my presentation. Thank you for listening. I really want to hear from you guys if you've seen the same in your context, and any other questions that I can help clarify from our experiences over the past little bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. That was a great overview and great presentation. We have a great picture of what's going on in Canada and also the challenges that we meet as a community working on open data, because we are a community. It's a rather strong community, but yeah, we do have our challenges. We're not the cool kids in town anymore, it seems. But yeah, so thank you for that. We'll go to the questions and comments at the end after we go through all our speakers. So now I will introduce our next speaker, which is Rochelle Hines. She's the Managing Director of What Works Cities. Rochelle's multi-sector career focused on policies and programs that seek to identify solutions to ending the cycle of poverty and vulnerable communities, dedicated to serving individuals, families, and children through a work in government, nonprofit, and philanthropic sector with an expertise in anti-poverty programs that span from birth to adulthood. Prior to joining Results for America to lead What Works Cities, building on plus 10 years of working in local governments. Rochelle led global operations and strategy for the city practice management team of 100 Resilient Cities Rockefeller Foundation and served as vice president of the U.S. Social Impact Team on Sesame Work, where she developed and led the scaling strategy of the Sesame Street in Communities initiative. Whoa, impressive. Thank you so much for joining us in this session, Rochelle. And I will be sharing the screen for your presentation. So let me go through that tricky process before you can start your presentation.
Great. Natalia, while you bring that up, thank you all for having me. Natalia, thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm excited to be here today to just connect with everyone on a topic that is near and dear to us here at What Works Cities. It's really a pleasure to be here. Next slide.
Yes.
So the What Works Cities program was actually launched by Bloomberg Philanthropies, and it's led by the NGO that I sit within called Results for America. And our goal is really about how do you assist local governments with using data and evidence-based practices to address the challenges of the day. So we're talking about things like climate change, equitable broadband access to homelessness. It's all with the goal of improving resident lives and how residents experience their city. Next slide. What Works Cities initially launched in 2015 to celebrate cities that were leading with data-informed and evidence-based decision-making. The program then began to evolve beyond just a celebration to creating an actual roadmap and standard for what good, well-managed, data-driven local government looked like. What we created is a standard that really benchmarks city practices, but also certifies cities on how well they're using data to inform policy decisions, allocate funding, equitably improve services, evaluate the effectiveness of programs, and engage residents. Notably, in September of 2022, our program went beyond just being a US-based program to all of North America, as well as Central and South America. Next slide. As I mentioned, we're open to North, Central, and South America with a population of at least 30,000 or more. We have over 160 cities represented in our network who range in like their individual city data maturity. And so think of cities that are starting to formulate data-informed policies and practices to cities with more advanced practices who are really thinking about how do you connect the dots on having these data-informed policies and practices, but making decisions that actually impact resident outcomes. When you engage with What Works Cities, it all starts with something we call as our assessment, which gives cities a benchmark of their data practices. And so when I say data practices, I'm thinking of things like data management. Do cities have rigorous evaluations in place? How are they engaging their stakeholders? What does leadership look like in a data-informed way? But also what we're talking about today, how these cities embracing and leading with open data. Once a city takes an assessment with us, they're able to gain access to a community that we have, which offers free technical assistance, again, to help cities advance in these areas. So help cities develop open data portals, help cities get better at rigorous evaluations, help cities think about how to design budget and finance that are results driven. We provide them with that free technical assistance, but then we also provide like resources and tools, and then this global network of peers. Next slide. We have over 74 cities, and as I mentioned, we had recently opened our program up to all of North America, Central and South America. We've had a tremendous response in Latin America. So far, we have 12 cities that are certified, as you can see, and you have some of them highlighted here. But since we've launched, it's like over 60 cities are just engaging with us and at some part of our process. Next slide. At What Works Cities, we look at 43 fundamental criteria across 8 foundational practices. Those practices include some things I highlighted before. So it's data management, rigorous evaluations, data-driven budget and finance, stakeholder impact, leadership and capacity, performance analytics, contracting, but then also open data. With open data, we actually have embedded in our standard a criteria on what does it mean to have a well-informed open data policy, and really help cities create a framework to follow when they're thinking about how to create a sustainable open data system. So we're thinking about how are you making sure it's informed in decision-making, how making sure your open data portal is truly transparent, but then also thinking about how do you leverage it to really build robust resident engagement. I think for us, that's a key, not just being able to put the data out there, but being able to connect it with residents and policies. So in practice, what we advise cities on and coach and support them through is codifying their open data policies, making sure that they think about how do you provide guidance to the community of data users that will be using the data that you make publicly available. What data sets are actually publicly available? Are those the data sets that are resonating with the community that they want to use? We also ask them to think about proactive user research practices to ensure that the programs consider the needs currently, but also future data users and needs. For us, again, it's also thinking about, and I think this was raised in the prior presentation, it's not just about open data, but also open data is connected to data management. And so we know that those two things go hand in hand, and we actually have a criteria on data management. And this includes being able to think about the quality of data that's being put out there, privacy, and of course, security. Next slide. So what we're seeing across the board is within our community in the North American context, but this does apply to Latin America as well, that we're seeing is cities are using their portals to share data to really communicate publicly about key citywide strategic priorities. They're using it to reflect resident interests and needs. This is a way to boost civic engagement. They're using it for performance-wide sort of measures and dashboards and how to give residents a sort of 360 view on what's happening in cities. What's exciting to us is that cities are using this to leverage co-design opportunities with community members. And so they're doing this at neighborhood meetings, they're having annual hackathons, they're doing data challenges. I think what we're also seeing in the field is that for those cities that have already been able to kind of set up their open data platforms and practices, they're also starting to evolve and shift. And they're evolving in a way from going from just publishing the data sets to crafting a comprehensive data and analytics service plan. So these services are designed to empower residents and staff with like actionable insights. So it's also using like data visualizations through dashboards and maps, informing decision making. I'm really making this data available. I think what's important is like it's a leap from cities leveraging open data to from a passive point of view that we're seeing to like a more active and proactive view. So that's more of service and directly has a community benefit. Next slide. Now I'll just highlight 2 of our certified cities that are, using open data in a creative way. Next slide. Norfolk, Virginia is a gold certified city that has been working with us for a while. In 2017, they adopted an open data policy. With their program, the goals were increasing transparency to public information. It also had the need of creating efficiency. So how do you reduce the need for public information requests? How do you make sure internal city departments are able to share their data efficiently through your open data portals? How do you engage residents, but not just residents, but businesses and academic institutions as well? It's also a way for them to think about data quality and incorporating user feedback on accuracy and consistency. When they launched, they maybe had like a handful of data sets that were available. Over time now, we have dozens of data sets that are available through Norfolk Open Data Platform. What I also like about what they're doing is they're offering tutorials to actually help the public navigate the portals. And so again, not just putting it out there, but making sure it's of service and of value. They also rolled out an annual datathon, and it's hosted by their Civic Lab. They have a variety of themes. One of the more recent themes was community wellness. And what they did is they had teams of 12 from local governments, regional bodies, academia, private sector, use data that they made publicly available to create some innovative solutions and ideas all around the idea of wellness. The team had a week to be able to develop their projects and present them before a committee of like local experts. And then these experts sort of rated them on analysis and relevance. Is it innovative and usability? I think this is a creative way of not only just putting the data out there, but making sure that the community of users are able to engage with it in a thoughtful way. And what's also exciting is it can spur innovation and ideas. Next slide. Another example in Norfolk, Virginia is that they connected it to just art. And so the Civic Lab commissioned artists within the city to design and create artwork for an exhibition that was going to spotlight the open data portal. And so they found creative ways to do that. And we're able to also give the artists a small stipend for their work. And again, this is another creative way that you can use open data to engage the public. Next slide. Next is another gold certified city that is within our portfolio, Detroit, Michigan. Like many data portals, they started with creating a portal that can help you access government services, highlight public safety records, property records, education, transportation, and health. As they are evolving, they really taking it from just the data to the visualization. So again, being in service and how to make sure the data is purposeful. Detroit is also proactively soliciting user feedback via surveys to ensure that the portal is actually directly connecting with users and needs and are being able to add value. And the way they engage the public is they have an annual open data challenge. This challenge is really to, again, increase community awareness around the portal and its availability. Participants are invited to create like visual representations. So again, taking the data and creating a story. So creating charts with it and graphs and infographics to be able to see how is the data connecting. And I think what's really cool about this is through this challenge, if you win, your submissions can be featured in the city's annual report, as well as showcased on the portal. This idea was actually inspired by another project called Dear Data. And this category encourages participants to track a specific activity or observation in Detroit for a week, and then create kind of doodles around it. And so these submissions include a picture of doodles along with a brief description of how the data was collected. And so participants can express their thoughts on open data through poems and songs and tweets and funny stories. And again, it's really building that capacity in a creative way, but also helping your community, your residents, your users, your institutions that serve your city be able to engage with data. They actually have a submission due later this month in March, and they plan to then be able to showcase those submissions. And the challenge is open to everyone. Next slide. These are like brief examples of how some certified cities in North America are leveraging data. I think within our community and what we're seeing across the board, open data is one of those more high achieving practices, with many cities still at the place of formulating their policies and practices. Really to understand like what are even the best platforms to use. I think a lot of cities that we're seeing sort of have that challenge. What is the platform that I need for today, but also the platform that I will need in the future as we continue to evolve with the usage of open data. I think for cities that are more advanced, that have these things in place, considering platforms, I think we're seeing them more go into how do you collect user insights to refine your approach and offerings so that it more closely aligns with public needs. And overall, there's just this evolution of open data policies morphing into data service standards, which is another area of work that we support within the What Works Cities community. But I will stop there and look forward to the discussion.
I'm muted, sorry. Thank you so much, Rochelle, for this presentation. This was great, a great overview of the work that you do and the potential of open data policies in the local level. We always talk about local level being kind of the front line to our citizens. So whatever happens in the local government actually makes like direct impact. So learning about these processes and these cities, also kind of engaging in innovative ways of data reuse, kind of calling for art presentations. It's super interesting. So we have a great overview of what's going on in the United States, and glad to see the What Works City programs also expanding to Latin America, which is also a huge open data region. So thank you so much for joining, and we'll go through to our third and last speaker for the session. Let me quickly introduce Maurice. Thank you for joining us. He's an Open Data Charter old colleague and friend. And thank you so much for being here. Let me formally introduce Maurice McNaughton, Director of the Caribbean Open Institute, Mona School of Business and Management. Maurice is a founding director of the Caribbean Open Institute, a regional coalition of Caribbean organizations that engages and works on regional commitments, researchers, technologists, and NGOs to raise awareness, strengthen capacity, and foster collaboration towards open development. Maurice is also the director of the Center for Innovation at the Mona School of Business and Management, IWI, and is doing an active research on the areas of open data, digital transformation, and digital capacity building. So Maurice, the floor is yours. You need to be able to showcase your presentation, no?
Yes, if I may. Thank you.
I need to give you permission. Let me find you here, Maurice. And there you go. You should be able to showcase your presentation now.
Okay, let me try that.
This is the crucial moment in every virtual session.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. We can see your presentation. So the floor is yours, Maurice.
All right, great. Thanks again, Natty. Hopefully I can make good use of my 10 minutes. So great. Good morning, everyone. Natty, thanks again for inviting me to participate in this ongoing discussion on open data. I think that we've been at this since its very inception, which is close to 10 years. So great to be here. Natty, as I mentioned, I'm going to take my cue a little bit from certainly the last edition of the Global Data Barometer, which we did in the Caribbean. And of course, the GDB goes a little bit beyond open data, but open data is one of the key components of the GDB in terms of the pillar that measures data availability. But it also looks at issues around governance, capacity, and of course, the extent to which we're using and generating impact from data which is opened up. One of our realizations was, broadly speaking, for the Caribbean, is that unfortunately, and I suspect this is not uncommon across the globe, unfortunately, there has been some regression in relation to open data, both in terms of it being an explicit part of the policy agenda, and certainly the extent to which there is a enduring commitment to publishing open data in the public sector. And even in cases, Natty, where we had some success in previous years with the publishing of open data portals, the sustained efforts at keeping those portals updated have kind of languished. And so the open data agenda in the Caribbean is really struggling a little bit. And to be frank, when we took a look at the recent results of the GDB, following on the previous open data barometer, our sort of preoccupation, sort of conviction, if I may, is that the thing that we can put perhaps most emphasis on is data capacity building, and kind of step back a little bit and try and build a culture of data, an appreciation of data as a critical asset to the region and at the level of countries. And then hopefully from there, being able to build on top of that to drive the open data agenda. So I want to, the other thing I'd probably mention is, obviously everyone is probably familiar with this data value chain. And again, we have made an effort to try and get the narrative and the conversations with the public sector to going beyond just opening up data and publishing data, but okay, what are we using it for? How can we generate impact? And the third thing that is going to sort of inform my narrative this morning is how data impacts the larger issue of development. And again, I'm borrowing from this this graphic, which was in the World Development Report from 2021. But again, trying to make the case for data as a big driver of development, but also some of the sort of adverse consequences if we don't manage data well, both in terms of governance and capacity, and again, building a positive culture. And so, as you probably see here, the need to build capacity across the public sector, the private sector, and generally speaking, civil society at large. So I use those three things to kind of frame the idea that perhaps the most important thing that we can do at the Caribbean Open Institute is put a lot of our primary focus on building capacity, trying to influence a positive data culture across the Caribbean. So if you don't mind, I'll just talk a little bit about the efforts we have had doing that. And again, we see this as a key sort of prerequisite, almost a leading activity, if you will, to ultimately accomplishing the kinds of goals that the open data agenda seeks to accomplish. So a lot of this work we've been doing through this initiative that we call the Caribbean School of Data. It is, a capacity building initiative that started with some quite important work that we did in Haiti a couple of years ago, back in 2019, working at building digital and data capacity with young women. And there's a model that we use that we found quite effective in trying to build capacity at scale. Because one of the challenges that we sort of contemplate is the idea of, well, it's important to sort of do this kind of capacity building, but how do we do it to scale so that we can impact, not just 20 people who can come to a workshop or 40 people, but how do we impact hundreds and thousands of persons? And so we've developed a model of capacity building, which is both virtual, and this was actually quite important through the COVID years. So it's both virtual, but at the same time, we use a kind of blended approach where we have trained facilitators that work with students in cohorts. So that I think everyone is familiar with the kind of high attrition that takes place when you're doing online training. So we've tried to use here a kind of virtualized but hybrid model where we have cohorted students, so 25 to 30 students, to train facilitators that work with them. So even though the content is online, they meet virtually once a week and make sure that they're kind of progressing through the program with the students. And that model has actually been fairly effective in helping to minimize the kind of attrition that takes place, and therefore giving us an opportunity to kind of scale this kind of capacity building. So the Caribbean School of Data program, we have been working pretty much across the Caribbean. A lot of it, a lot of the focus of activities in Jamaica, but we've done programs in the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, as I mentioned, in Puerto Rico, in Trinidad and Tobago, and in Guyana. And again, it has become a fairly effective model for capacity building, so much so that we've been able to engage some really important partnerships. But just to share a little bit with you on some of the demographics, one of the things that we've tried to do, and it's a kind of Natty, a kind of saying, well, physician, heal thyself, right? If we're talking to persons about the importance of data and analytics, then we embed analytics in the way we develop and deliver this program, so that every interaction, every engagement with someone who is participating in the program is captured, so that we have quite good analytics on both the demographics of the program and the throughput in terms of the progress of the students. One of the things that is interesting for us, that may be interesting for you, is that in a program that's driven by an open call, almost 75% of the participants are female. And we found that quite interesting, given the sort of traditional notions of tech and who is interested in technology or tech type programs. The other thing that is interesting as well is that when we look at the age demographic, even though the program was originally designed to target young people between the ages of, say, 16 to 30, the participant demographic runs the full gamut from 16 to 60. So that we find a lot of our senior citizens that are expressing an interest in, how do I get involved in this kind of program? How do I learn about this thing called the digital space and working with data? So those are some interesting analytics that have come out of that. And this is kind of just the kind of competencies that we have embedded in the program. For us, what this has given us an opportunity to do as a platform is to engage in some really important partnerships. So for the past 2 years, we've been working with one of the regional telecoms providers in rolling this program out. And just recently, we signed an agreement with them to do this for up to 10,000 students across 5 countries in the Caribbean. So that kind of partnership, that kind of relationship gives us the scale that we think is important for this kind of capacity program to be impactful, and ultimately to have a kind of culture of data begin to seep into the broader ecosystem. We've also had an interesting partnership with our colleagues over at the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. And obviously, open mapping data is one of the really powerful components of the open data ecosystem. And so we've been doing some work in community mapping to see how we can get, again, a culture of not just data and a culture of open data, but a culture of mapping embedded. So those are some important partnerships that we've been working through. And this is another interesting project. We've worked on Natty, trying to make the link between the data ecosystems and the broader development agenda. But perhaps I could talk a little bit about that during our question and answer, because I'm conscious that I'm a little bit out of time. But the last thing I'll mention is that we've also been working with the Responsible AI Index, the Global Index for Responsible AI. So the Caribbean is part of that larger project of looking at the way countries and governments and civil society largely is positioned for this AI revolution. And again, one of our things is that good AI is only possible if it sits on top of good data capacity, good data governance. And so what we've been doing is connecting open data, not just as an end in and of itself, but as a means to some of these other emerging agendas. And we think that's quite important. So Natty, let me stop there. That's a little bit about the Caribbean School of Data. It's our way of kind of stepping back and looking at capacity as the critical enabler for ultimately what we're trying to accomplish with the open data agenda and the broader data for development agenda. So very open to the conversations and questions that might follow this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maurice. And once again, a great overview. Super happy this open house for North America and the Caribbean has been able to actually showcase what's going on a little bit in the region. And I'm so glad to have you all as speakers. Now in open house manner, we open the floor for questions, comments, but also if somebody in the audience also wants to share a project or an idea that they are working on, the floor is also yours. So let's start to see if anybody has, everybody is a little bit scared at the beginning, and then we have questions in the last 2 minutes. Let's see if we have a question. I see some cameras. So does anybody have a question? Don, please go ahead.
So I'm working on a project. My company is in Sportify, and I am looking to collect program data from municipalities, specifically here in Canada, but I do have the intention of rolling this out into other regions. It's tricky, and I'm navigating it with Christian, the help of Christian and Open North. Do you guys have any recommendations of how to navigate that? I mean, I'm a outsider to this whole aspect. Open data was something I imagined in my own head, just to find that everybody else was thinking about it as well. So, real layman here. So,
Any comments for Don? Any ideas?
What are you
So-
looking to do?
I hear somebody speaking. Please speak up. Please speak out loud.
Yeah,
So-
I'm asking Don, can you just clarify what are you looking for exactly?
so I created a platform, a social media platform. It's really just a fancy calendar that helps local athletes find drop-in programs or any sporting programs. My problem is locally, I have 6,500 athletes who just keep coming and coming and coming and asking me questions, and I just don't have the capacity to answer it. So it kind of forced this platform to be built. But imagining this local tool and how it could potentially work in other regions, my biggest issue is basically getting that data from already existing programs. We have robust, every municipality has drop-in programs for soccer or basketball or baseball, whatever the situation. That data exists somewhere, and how to properly harvest it and put it into the app so that it's functional for people to be able to engage with it. I think that's my first level, my first challenge. I have built a standardized CSV that I can distribute around, but I mean, this is just the beginning of a much broader conversation. But yeah, I'm just looking for, hey, what do you got going on at your civic arena at the end of your street? What's, maybe I could send some people. Does that clarify?
Well, yeah, if I might make one quick comment, if I may, Natty. That's interesting, Don. I'm big into track and field myself, being in Jamaica, as you would appreciate. But one of the things that I think is quite underrated in the whole open data narrative, there's almost a presumption that good open data has to come from the public sector, because the sort of underlying premise is that governments collect all of this data and they publish it and make it freely available. I think citizen-generated data that comes from the crowd, is one of the big opportunity areas that is still a little bit under exploited. And so the idea that you have the community itself contribute data, and obviously if you can do that to scale, then that becomes a very powerful resource. So I think as you try to design this kind of, let's call it athletic or sports data ecosystem, for want of a better word, and you're trying to broaden the scale of it, think in terms of how you can incentivize people to contribute data from their own sort of local context, right? I think that's a very powerful way. And we're actually doing some of that now, as I mentioned, in the work that we're doing with HOT around community mapping, because the data that citizens generate in terms of mapping their communities is as powerful as any data that exists in any centralized government agency, because it is based on local knowledge. So yeah, I would just make the point to kind of sort of think through your business model around this, and how can you incentivize people to actually contribute data to this larger ecosystem. But that would be my comment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I really do appreciate it. There's kind of a two-way street with this project, with the athletes being able to find different programs to engage in. It also, without giving up personal, information, stuff like that, as you say, mapping. So this is a cultural platform. We're going to see how many people are wanting to play basketball at 10 a.m. in the morning and what that demographic looks like. So we can actually advise organizations to create programs to fulfill those demands. So it is very much a two-way street. It's tricky to briefly go through all the potential there, but I think everybody who's in this conversation understands how many different layers to the onion there possibly can be, and delivering a better society where, you know, we're real-time engaged, protected, and mapped. I guess that's it. You know, our culture is mapped. So
Yeah,
I definitely want to do this in Jamaica too.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that comment, that question, and thanks, Maurice, for the idea. I see we have a hand up. Chris, please go ahead.
Well, first, thank you all so much for your presentations and the work that you do. Maurice, you used the word regression, and it's something we're very concerned about at OpenAQ as well. And I'm just going to pose a question like, do we think that governments are going backwards because they're not seeing impact? Or do we think they're going backwards because they see impact? Meaning maybe they just don't really love the fact that the public is getting more engaged because they don't want to actually respond to the public. I'm just posing that sort of big question, and how, you know, we need to turn this around. So we all need to work together to do that.
Yeah, I don't know, Rochelle, do you want to comment on that? I'd have a comment, but perhaps you might
Sure.
go
Thank you,
first.
Maurice. So one of the things, it takes courage, right? And I think what we often talk about with the mayors that engage with us is part of open data is like courageous leadership. And courageous leadership means leading into transparency. And that means the public will hold you accountable. But that is your role, is to be of service. But we also flip it the other way to help them see it can, you know, it's holding you accountable. But the flip side is it also helps you justify why you're making investments in the way that you are, because the data is leading you to do that. So a lot of what we talk about at What Works Cities is also equity. And so open data, equity, it's all layered on top of each other. And when the data tells us, you know, infrastructure is one of the things we're talking a lot about here in the US context is, where have you made infrastructure investments and make that publicly available? And no surprise to most people working in this field, there's underrepresented communities that have not had infrastructure investments in decades. So the data tells me this is where I need to make the investment. So that is why your street isn't getting paved, but theirs is. And so it can help and be an asset. And I think it needs to be framed in that way with leaders so that they can step into that courageously. But I think we also just have to challenge them to be transparent. That is part of leadership, is being transparent and being okay with being held accountable. It's to your advantage, but also can help you execute on your priorities as well.
Yeah,
Christian, I see your hand up. Do you want to jump in?
I think Maurice had a
And-
comment. So
Sorry, Maurice. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just very quickly. You know, to be very honest, Chris, at a point in time when it was the flavor of the month, and OGP and the open data agenda were quite sort of politically fashionable, then we had champions, right? And once we go through the political cycle and leadership changes and those champions go away, it's almost as if the agenda disappears with them. And that's problematic, because it should be something that is sustainable across individual sort of champions. So we have not found that. So I would not even say that it's a conscious will to step away from it. It's just that there are other sort of priorities in the political agenda. You speak to someone about open data and they say, well, my preference is to go and build some schools. And though you can't argue with that if they're positioning it against those kinds of social initiatives. For us, we've kind of moved the narrative and the conversation a little bit away from just open data and being accountable and transparent by opening up data. And we've made it more of a value outcome conversation. So we've had some very progressive discussions, for instance, in the last few years, talking to government actors in our tourism and agricultural sector about the opportunities for linkages, right? In Jamaica, which is obviously, like the rest of the Caribbean, very heavily tourism dependent, a big part of the food input to our tourism sector is imported. And just taking the data and looking at agricultural data and tourism data and the linkages between those, and we've identified a potential value impact of almost 1% GDP if one makes effective use of those linkages. So those are the kinds of conversations that we're having about the value impact. And then, okay, so to accomplish this outcome, then we need to open up data. So we move the conversation and the narrative from, okay, well, let's open up data and see what good comes of it. Okay, here are some specific value outcomes. It requires data from these two sectors. So let's open that up and see if we can accomplish that. So by changing the narrative that way a little bit, it makes it possible to work on more sort of specific initiatives and interventions rather than just a general conversation about, well, let's, open up data and let's publish a government portal and let's populate it with as many data sets as we can. And I think that kind of approach is likely to lead to greater purchase. So it's perhaps, Chris, about being patient and seeing out this sort of regression. Sometimes you have to take one step back to take two steps forward, right, Natty? So yeah, we're kind of there.
Definitely. And just on one note, we always say that open data is not just about the data. It also involves a cultural change, and cultural change takes time.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
We will have backlash on that. And so patience, I think, is part of the core business we're all in. Christian, please go ahead.
Yeah, and I wanted to jump on that backlash, because even though I do agree there is, and we see that in Canada, there is political fatigue, and yeah, I think Matthew referenced, like, we're no longer the cool kids on the block. And when we're talking about open data, I do want to highlight that like there is like very hostile actors that do very much identify data and transparency as something that they don't want. And I don't think, like, in North America, we are very privileged to live in a region that is relatively stable, democratic values, that most people agree that transparency is a good thing. But that's not always the case, right? And we've seen other places, and I've seen other places regress in that and have very hostile governments towards the open data and the transparency agenda, that do not want this information published. So I want to make sure we're thinking about that as well. I mean, even like right next door to where I am, in a place like Venezuela that is very actively against transparency. How do we work as a region? How do we work to build that resilience, so that if there is in fact that democratic backsliding, that the movement is able to be protected or live somewhere else? And obviously this comes from experiences in Myanmar and Russia, where that's happened quite recently, and maybe to a lesser scale in North America too. We've seen hostile actors that don't necessarily like data, don't necessarily like transparency.
Yeah, Rochelle, I see you.
Yeah, I just had one point that I want to make, and we touched on, when you think about sustainability, I also think about getting beyond just your elected officials and engaging with your public servants, getting your public involved, your academic institutions, your community-based organizations. You get those folks engaged in these policies, these works, and they're seeing added value, then you can build the will and keep the momentum. I think sustainability has to go beyond just sort of like leadership at the top. And we spend a lot of time thinking about that with our work, because we do capacity building. It's not enough for us to just do it at the top. If we're actually trying to keep these practices going, we need to get to the civil. We work with local governments directly. So working with the civil servant staff, that's how you can build some of the continuity of practice that will then infuse the work and keep it moving.
Definitely. And then on a kind of a different scale, when we see some national or federal governments backsliding, we see local and subnational governments being kind of the leads that keep that flame going. Whenever we talk about open data and open government, at least in the Americas, we can say, not only North America and Caribbean, but also Latin America, that's the case. We've made it to the time that we had for this session. I'm so happy of this first session. Thank you so much once again to all our magnificent speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your ideas, your challenges. And I hope I see you all next year for another North American and Caribbean session. And for everybody who's interested in the other sessions, you can join Eventbrite. We will definitely be sending emails anyway, but we have one session for LATAM this Thursday, and then next week a session for Africa and Europe, and then last week of the month a session for Asia and the Pacific. So you'll get all the information. Once again, thank you everybody who joined. Thank you for being at this open house, and happy Open Data Month, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.